Hello, everybody. It's getting to be a habit with all you lovely people. It's another rainy day in New York. So I had planned to go out and meet a friend. We were going to paint in Central Park today, but not happening. So here I am with you. But I thought, given that, what I would try to do for you today is something would be a subject that I'd probably paint if I were outside, but also, I think more importantly, an approach I would take to something a little quicker, a little more straightforward. I think in some ways a little more helpful just because of its straightforward nature, but also the kind of thing I would paint plein air and as much as I can recreate it here in the studio, more the approach I would take if I were on site. So something overall probably a little more expedient and quicker, less studied, and less formal. Subject is going to be one of the very beautiful bridges in Central Park, which has so many. This is one of my favorites. Strange name though, it's called the Driprock Bridge. And it's a combination of limestone and brick. Very beautiful, sort of a Victorian design from, I think, around 1880, maybe the late 1870s, designed by Calvert Vaux, who worked with Olmstead in the original design of the park. There are a great many of these beautiful bridges, all slightly different designed, just great subjects, beautiful to look at, beautiful to walk under or over, and really fun to paint and draw. So I took a couple reference photos the other day, just so that you can see what I'm working with. And also just to talk about my process as far as one of my broken records is the caution I think we should all take when using reference photos. That's why painting on site is so, well, it's fun, but it's so instructive. It just helps us make decisions, find compositions, work out ideas in a much more hands-on, expedient way than we can ever really do in the studio. But if you paint plein air at all, the lessons you learn are so useful, both in painting on site, but also for any studio work you might do. Apologize for my voice. I'm going to use this reference as the primary one. As always, if any of you watch my work, you know that I might do a sketch from life or even from a photo. Then I will hide the photograph from myself so that I don't fall into the habit, which we can develop almost unconsciously, of being a little too informed by it. But also the reference sketch helps me just nail down the format. I think landscape format is the way to go here. Horizontal, a little more intimate, a little bit more personal, a little bit more ground-based oriented than a vertical format would be. So I'm looking here as I'm sketching this out, just looking at the overall cropping, how much context do I want to put in. These subjects have so many of the things that I love to paint, but primarily this idea of contrast. I talk a great deal about that. You know, obviously light versus dark, but as far as narrative or intention in painting, I'm really taken with the idea of conflict and resolution, or contrast. Two opposite forces or ideas maybe meeting on the surface of the page to find a kind of resolution. So I'm always really taken with the idea of, well, many different kinds of contrast or conflicts. But I love this whole idea of the natural world clashing with the man-made world. And Central Park is one of the best places I can think of to study that kind of thing, because it's really just a natural wonder in the middle of obviously a very large, dense, often chaotic city. So here what I'm doing is just studying quickly. I'll do this on site too. But studying the elements that I might want to put into my painting, the elements that I might want to edit out. This beautiful historic lamppost, for example. I'm really thinking now whether or not I want to include it. I don't think it's a big deal. I think it could run the risk of being a little distracting. If I find it compositionally useful, however, I might put it in. So yeah, I'm thinking about things, the compositional elements, the intent first and foremost of this painting, which I really do. It really is intended to talk about this clash of different worlds, the man-made and the natural world. So it's a pretty straightforward intention story, but I think that's fine. So intention is always the first thing I think about. That helps me decide the formatting, the cropping, the overall look and feel, the narrative, if you will, of the painting I may want to do. And then once I get just at least a general idea of that in mind, then I can start thinking about how do I want to compose the visual elements of the painting on the page. And once I start getting a handle on that, then I start thinking about my third most important consideration, and that is values. I always work in three primary values. You can't forget that we are working on a flat, two-dimensional surface. All we really have going for us is width and height. So I think even if you work in a completely abstract way, it's always good to think about what we can do. We may not want to, but we may want to play around with the idea of trying to imply this illusion of depth and dimension in our work. A foreground, midground, background. One of the downsides of photographs, of course, is that they have a way of sort of unifying all the values. Everything in the background looks about as clear and crisp as everything in the foreground. When we're walking through the world, we understand that these trees and those buildings, etc., are farther away. But if we paint them or draw them just like that, it's not as convincing, and we end up with work that can look very flat and one-dimensional, and I do not want that. So to that end, you can think in your work about how to manipulate the elements of a painting, the saturation, the edges, the values, etc., to imply something in the foreground, something in the midground, something in the background. Generally, things in the background are going to be softer, looser, washier, softer edges, less defined, less saturated colors, and more muted values. You know, and not always, there are a million exceptions, but generally that is what happens. Conversely, in the foreground, things tend to look harder, crisper, harder edges, more saturated values, brighter colors. And again, not always. There are paintings where you don't want to do that for one reason or another. In this painting, it's such a straightforward idea that I think I'm going to have a very straightforward approach to it. Meaning I'm going to put probably my darkest elements in the foreground, not all of them, but most of them, to form this almost a C shape of value, forming the tree trunk, the trees, the shadows. In the midground, the bridge itself, I'm going to have it slightly backlit, I think, so it will be darker, but not as dark as these elements in the foreground. The darks, I call a 3. Midtones, I generally call 2. The lightest lights, generally, if you want to establish a center of focus in your painting, which I do recommend, the viewer's eye is almost automatically going to be drawn to wherever the lightest light meets the darkest dark. You don't have to go by what you see in the real world or what you see in a photograph. You can change, you can alter, you can redesign the observed reality to what you want in your painting. I want the darkest darks to, as I say, fall here in the foreground a bit, but also secondarily under the bridge, the shadow, and the shade. And then that'll set up a really nice sort of pattern, a sandwiching of values. Dark, light, leading the viewer into the painting under the bridge. And I think that'll help establish things along the Z-axis. The X-axis will be here, the dominant horizontal. The Y-axis will be somewhere here, the secondary, strongest vertical. But the Z-axis will be the one that leads the viewer into the painting along this imaginary pathway into this imaginary sense of depth, perspective, and dimension. So this is a lot longer than I would normally spend if I were just by myself or with a friend sketching, but I want to just do my best to talk you through my process as I'm doing it. So again, this is Driprock Bridge in Central Park, a very soggy Central Park today. So this doesn't mean I won't change anything when I go to the final painting. It doesn't mean I won't leave room for improvisation or difference, but this helps me establish where I want to save my whites and place my darks as much as anything else. Saving the lights in your watercolor is probably the single most important thing you can do, because in watercolor we don't really paint the light. We paint the darks, we paint the shades, we paint the shadows that give life its identity. So establishing where you want to save light before you even touch your brush to the page is essential, because once the light gets lost in your painting, it's very hard or impossible to get it back. So this at least just tells me my overall formatting, the overall cropping, the general sizing of things I want in my page. And it's starting me to think about how I can make hopefully a better image than show in the photographs, somewhat more dynamic. In terms of perspective, you can see I've changed the tilt of the bridge to a little bit more dynamic angle, a stronger 2-point perspective. I think that will help. It'll help bring the viewer in. I've manipulated the values a bit, as you can see. I should just say, as an overall composition, it's very straightforward. A rule of thirds here coming into play, the golden mean, coming in with a strong 1/3 band along the bottom as the dominant horizontal. About 1/3 of the way in from the left side is the secondary vertical axis. So it's very straightforward, classic composition, nothing weird or unusual. I know that a lot of my content to date on YouTube, though I haven't done that much yet, but I've done a lot of sort of, I guess I'd call them, not everything, but many things are somewhat very personal, a little bit experimental here and there, and all that's well and good. But I want to be as useful as I can and give some useful, more everyday kind of content as well. So that is what's happening now. So on the paper, I'm using an Arches paper at 12 inches by 16. So moderately smallish, mid-size, not too large. And I'm going to just start laying in the the elements. For now, I'm not even looking at any reference. I'm just sketching right from my sketch and from how I think this should look. I will dip back into the reference photos, but hopefully not too much. I want to really use my reference sketch as my my roadmap, or my Bible, if you will. For my bigger, more formal works, I will sometimes use a straight edge on very big, especially architectural subjects. I might make some light lines with straight edge and then perhaps freehand next to them. For plein air work, or more sketch-based things, this being an example of one of those, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do all this freehand. I don't, just for the record, think it's absolutely wrong to use straight edges here and there, but they can become a bit of a crutch, and they do have a way, or they can have a way, if you rely on them too heavily, of making your work look a little stiff and rigid, and sometimes that's just what you want for a very formalistic or very architectural style of painting, which I happen to love. It's just not always right. I just don't want to leave you with the impression that there's a right way or a wrong way, or a thing you should do or a thing you shouldn't do. I think it all depends. As a general rule of thumb, though, I think an over-reliance on tools, technical tools to make your drawings more precise can result in an overly technical feel, which again may be what you want, but I would say generally speaking it's probably not what you want. All right, so I've just lightly laid in the general perspective of the bridge shapes, pretty much on track for what I see here. It is a two-point perspective, meaning you see a bit of this side of the element, you'll see a bit of this side, but only reflected a little bit in the left sides of the columns, and primarily in the underside of the bridge overpass. I'm not really establishing vanishing points. I'm just sort of guessing. It's just sketching. I would say this vanishing point 1 would probably be here somewhere. Vanishing point 2 way out there in space. Not necessary to locate it. Just knowing it's there and knowing that all of these elements eventually resolve on the horizon line, which is here, is usually all you need. This is a beautiful bow arch, meaning it starts, the radius is strong, and then it flattens out. So it's not a standard half round or Gothic arch that's pointed. It's these elegant, I love these kinds of arches. They're actually a little easier to draw sometimes than a perfectly round one would be. Just a little tip, if you want to find the center of where an arch would be, you can establish the edges of it, and in this case, you can, if you really need to, just draw a light line connecting top and bottom, bottom and top of the overall connecting area. Where that crosses, that's going to form the center of that arch. And not in this sketch too much, but in other kinds of drawings, that can be a very useful thing to know. When you're drawing or painting on site, your underdrawing should be, I hate the word should, generally probably should be a little looser, a little more schematic, a little less defined than, I'm picking my words carefully because I really hate as a person and certainly as an instructor to ever tell anybody what you should or shouldn't do. But just because of the nature of plein air painting, you're usually standing. It's generally the practice, or it generally happens, that you sort of have to finish your work in an hour or two, perhaps. So anything you can do to streamline that process, that's what I'm driving at, is probably something worth thinking about. So it's not that I'm saying these things because you have to do them or you should do them, but they're just tips as ways to make your life a little easier. Where I'm going with all this is drawing too much while you're on site can just make you an unhappy person. If you love to draw, as I do, maybe you just want to do a drawing and not a painting, and that's okay too. Or maybe you want to draw your subject for 2 or 3 hours. Who am I to tell you you shouldn't do that? I will say, if you're trying to do something fairly quick and schematic, it's almost always advisable to not do that, to try to draw only what's necessary and not too much. I do love to draw, and I can be guilty of getting a little lost in the drawing just because I love to do it. So again, I don't want to say it's wrong, but just like everything else in painting, probably in life, there are advantages and disadvantages. Oh yeah, it reminds me, I got taken to task the other day by somebody here on lovely, courteous YouTube who thought I was too reliant on my drawings. He felt very strongly about it. Well, all I can say is I never tell anybody what you should or shouldn't do. There's never one right way to paint, to draw, to make art. There just isn't. There's perhaps what you prefer and styles you like, and that's fine. Everybody should have an opinion, absolutely should. But there are reasons I do what I do, and there are some paintings I do that are more reliant on drawings than others, and some that are less reliant on drawing. And yeah, I don't know. All I'm saying is I'm never a person to sit here and say this is the right way or the only way. I will say there are methods and ways and styles that might appeal to me or appeal to you that are different, and that's good. But you don't need to, I guess in brief, if you have an opinion, that's good. I want you to. And you don't have to ever agree with me. On the other hand, you don't really have to tell me about it either. I'm perfectly okay if you have an opinion that's very different than mine or don't agree with me. I don't mind. But yeah, you don't have to tell me. I've been drawing and painting for so many years. I certainly am not lacking in humility to say that I'm always learning and always trying to improve. I really, truly am. But I don't do anything without a reason or without consideration. So it doesn't mean I can't do things differently or that I might be painting or drawing very differently in a year. But yeah, I'm not unconscious of what I'm doing or why I'm doing it. So I encourage you to all have your opinions, and you can even tell me about it. But nobody is more adamant than I am about my own work and the path that I'm on than I am. because I love this idea of contrast so much, it might be what this one person who wrote me didn't understand or maybe didn't care about, and that's fine. But yeah, the whole idea of contrast, two opposite kinds of things meeting. I love just as overall subject matter, I love the rationality, the occasional rigidity, the sometimes precision of architecture, clashing, contrasting with the loose, more expressive methodologies behind watercolor painting. I love those kinds of works where there's sometimes, not always, but sometimes a more rational, a more precise, a more almost technical drawing with very loose, expressive watercolor wash laid over. Doesn't have to be for everyone, but I love those kinds of subjects sometimes. But again, not always. Doesn't have to be right for you or for every painting. So as far as drawing this, I think that's probably all I really need to tell the story. I'm pretty happy with the overall perspective. It still looks formal enough. Like you're looking fairly directly at the bridge, but I threw it into a stronger perspective so that it recedes a little bit more to the right. And I think overall fills up the page in a more graceful and resolved way than it tended to look in the photos. There's these beautiful pathways that lead all through the park, of course. In this particular case, it's fairly rigidly just coming out right at us. And so I am considering maybe giving this a bend that it doesn't have. Doesn't really matter, but I think if I want to play up this Z-axis, sort of leading the viewer into the painting, that little move might give this painting a little bit more poetry. Central Park is very known for its beautiful outcroppings, primarily of granite. A lot of the rocks were there, but they weren't where they are. They were designed and placed there by the designers and builders of the park. It's just so magical. But yeah, it's another thing I love about Central Park is that there's so much thought and care and love and passion behind its conception and its the execution of it. It's just magical. And it too deals a lot with the ideas of art that I love, the idea of this rough-hewn, unmanicured landscape clashing with the utterly pristine, very manicured. It's really a beautiful contrast. Okay, I do want this big dark tree here in the foreground. I will say when it comes to drawing, you might get away with over-detailing or spending a little too much time on your architectural elements. But I can say with a lot of painful personal experience that overdrawing trees is generally a very bad idea, especially in leaves and the foliage and that sort of thing. I think placing the basic shapes where you want them to go is fine and good, but trying to draw each and every little individual leaf is just going to make you, well, very unhappy person and ending up with a very rigid, tight painting. big characterful trunks like this, if the trees are very dominant in your composition, as this one is, I think it's all right to draw in a little character on the actual tree trunk. But again, no need to overdo it. Just placing the big shapes where you want them is generally going to be enough. I don't want, there's nothing wrong with this either. If you want to do tree portraits, that's fine, but I don't want this painting to come across like a portrait of trees. They're not really the star of the show. They're big, important compositional elements, but I don't want them to dominate or talk over the bridge itself, which really is the star. If you're going to erase on your paper, a soft white vinyl eraser, I think, is one of the best choices. An eraser that's too hard is going to mar, scuff, literally scratch your paper. You don't want that. There's a lot of information in the background, but because I want it to be far away, obviously I don't want to highlight it too much. And I'm sitting here wondering if I need to even indicate some of these buildings across the park. I often like to do that just because it really helps emphasize the narrative. I think for this, I'm not going to. I don't know that they're going to bring that much to the party. I'll have a little sky showing through, but not a lot. And I'll just indicate some very loose trees in the background. On this side, I hadn't quite decided whether I wanted to put in another tree that's kind of not there, or this light standard. I think not. I think the only man-made element I want to include will be the bridge itself. And I'm going to edit out, excise out all the other man-made elements, the exception being the pathway, of course, but no light standards, no buildings in the background. I'm just going to keep it very straightforward and simple. So here I'm going to work another tree up on this opposite rise. I'm not trying to do tree portraits, but I'll take a few inspirations from what's there and just invent the rest. It's good enough. So this is just to sort of design the overall shape or the amount of space I want that tree to incorporate. I think that'll do. And then I definitely want to work in some of this flavor, these overhanging branches. I won't use the reference because they don't seem to do what I want. But again, I want to establish this large C shape of very organic matter forming a composition. So again, I'll let the brush sort of draw all this stuff, but I think I'll trail some of these branches down across. I think for drawing, that's about all I'm going to do. I think about adding some figures. Again, that's a situation where it's not always right or wrong. Depends on the kind of feeling or story you want to tell. Whether you want people in your paintings at all or not. It's not a yes or no answer. I don't think it can be. I think it depends. I'd like to animate this scene a bit, so I'm going to include them. I'm not going to take the exact placement or types directly off the photos. I think that's almost always a mistake, unless you're doing some kind of portraiture, which I'm not. The people here are important, or I wouldn't put them in, but they're not dominantly important. So again, the bridge is the star. The people are just going to be here for scale, narrative, texture, and, you know, overall flavor of the painting. It's a very sketch-based painting, so everything in the painting I want to be more or less in that vein, in that flavor, if you will. So just the way I don't want to over detail the trees or even over detail the bridge itself, I don't want to over detail the figures, which is very, very easy to do. When you're sketching away and you run up against something that's arguably a little harder to draw, the tendency is to hold your breath, tighten up, and you end up getting very specific, very tight, and that's not cool. So, yeah, the people look a little bit more specific than these trees might in some ways, but they don't need a lot of work. They don't need a lot of detail. Here's a little tip, I think, that's useful for drawing figures in sketch-based paintings. If you just draw a head, some acknowledgement of a neck, 2 little lines for shoulders, the rest of the body can literally just hang off of that with a couple of brush marks when you're painting, or if you're sketching, just a couple of very quick marks. The last thing you want to do is over detail the figures. Again, if they look out of character with the rest of the painting, they'll look as if they've wandered in from another work and look really out of place. That said, like anything else, when an object gets closer to you, the tendency, again, it's sometimes the thing to do, but not always. Logic would tell you, well, this figure wants to be a little bit more detailed and specific than that figure. And that's probably true most of the time. However, you don't want to give even a foreground figure too much character, too many colors, shapes, things going on. I'm working this figure in because I'm anticipating this dark shadow coming across the foreground, and I want to incorporate this figure into it to animate that shadow shape and give it a really more interesting texture against the bridge itself. So that said, I'm not giving this foreground figure really all that much detail. A little more specific around the head and shoulders. The rest of the figure quite schematic, again, because it's going to become part of this overall shape. Another thing to think about when you're drawing figures in your work is numbers of them. Even in this photograph, people, often walk in pairs with their friends or significant others or whatever, which is fine, of course, but if you replicate that in your drawing or painting, you can start to get that famous Noah's Ark look, 2, 2, 2, 2. And it's just a way to make your drawings look very rigid and kind of unorganic. And it's a very simple thing to do once you're aware of that, to not do that, and then mix up the numbers of people. Have a single figure perhaps, a pair. Maybe back here you can add in, way in the distance, 3 or 4 people standing together, just to scramble up sort of the overall mixture and numbers of people so that it doesn't look too uniform or too regimented. That's fine. I don't want to make it look too busy. I think for me it's important in this work to make this, it could easily be 2 people, but I think 1 is a better choice. It will integrate better into my overall shadow, I think. I gave a child to this person. I hope it's their child or someone they know. And yeah, animals. I don't mind drawing people walking dogs. Of course, it's something you see everywhere, and of course, I love dogs. And I do this a lot, but I'm also aware that it can make your drawings, like if you add birds in the sky or people walking dogs, that sort of thing. Fine to do it, but know what you're doing. Make them look like they belong in the painting, not too cute or nostalgic or precious. Just gestural, simple, I think, is the way to go. So I think for the line drawing, everybody, that's about all I intend to do. Relatively fast. Obviously, I was a little slower on some of the more architectural details, but still, it looks loose, I think, loose-limbed and schematic. Just the overall flavor I wanted is pretty much there. So now I'm going to just jump right into the painting. I already prepped my palette, so I can do that. I started to reference it earlier, but my first consideration when I do any painting at all is the intention. What do I want it to say? How do I want it to feel? What story, if you like that phraseology, do I want it to tell? What's the overall feeling? I think what's your intent is the best way I know how to phrase that. Once you have a general direction, then you can start working on your composition. How do I want to place all the visual elements of my intention on a piece of paper? Which format, what cropping, how far or close do I need to be? All those sorts of things start to occur to you long before the brush touches the paper. Then your value design. Dark, lights, midtones. You don't have to go from jet black to pure white. Certainly you can, but you don't have to. But I do think you need a strong dynamic design of values from your darkest darks through your midtones to your lightest lights. You are the artist, so you can compress that or expand that to tell a louder story. A narrower value range is going to tell a quieter, more introspective story, and a wider value range is going to be a little more exuberant, a little more colorful in the sense of expressiveness. This I want to read as a fairly bright, clear day, so I want a fairly wide value range. I'm going to save pure whites here, very light greens here, but pure light on the path, both here and here, untouched white paper, perhaps even a little behind the bridge, or very lightly touched. And then very dark shadows here and up front. A wider value range to tell a bigger, happier, more exuberant story. Lastly, my 4 design considerations. Color. I love color, we all do, but I don't think any color, no matter how beautiful, is going to save a painting that doesn't have a good value design, doesn't have a decent composition, and has no intention. So color is great, but it has to serve a purpose, I believe. It has to serve a larger purpose. So again, contrast. I always like to work in complementary colors, cools versus warms. My bridge is stone and brick. I have the power, if I wished, to change it up to make it purple or green or anything I want, but I don't. I want to be fairly faithful to what's there, so I'm going to make it earth tones, brick colors for the red, earthier tones for the stonework. Given that is going to be my star of the show, if you will, is going to be dominantly warm, so I'll want a good deal of cool in this particular case to contrast that. It's spring here in the city, so there will be a lot of this green both in the trees and on the shrubs and grass that are blooming now. So I hopefully will get a very easy slam dunk contrast story going on here between the cool greens, the warms of the bridge. The sky, there isn't much of it. Blue, yeah, it could be. I haven't thought it through. There's not a lot of sky showing, and I don't want it to be too dominant. The value is more important than the actual color. So I think I'm going to go for a later in the day, softer tonality for the sky, meaning a yellow. If I go to almost pure white, pale yellow for the sky, deeper violet tones for some of the shadows that'll happen in the foreground, I think I'll get a nice electric zing between the yellow and violets, the greens and the reds. So there's a complementary story going on. Turn the page upside down. As you can see, I'm painting at a slope, as I always do. This is about a 30-degree angle, my easel indoors. This is a mid-size mop brush, one of my own Neef brushes. Holds a good deal of water. These are just great for laying in big, wet, sloppy washes. That was just clear water because I want to, again, save as much light as I can right around that bridge as possible. This is just some Naples yellow. Naples yellow is a bit tricky because it has a bit of opacity to it. It works beautifully on pure white or untouched paper, but it doesn't mix as well as more transparent tones. So I use it pretty much just on white paper. The reason I use it at all is because it's just a very subtle, beautiful, buttery yellow that's not too acidic, it's not too green, it's not too orange or brown like a yellow ochre. It's just a very beautiful, neutral yellow tone. But it is not the most transparent. Winsor Newton makes a color called transparent yellow, which is actually beautiful. There's also Aurelian, which is very transparent. There's a lot of yellows you can buy, so I'm not pushing Naples yellow. Quite the opposite. I think it's a little bit of a risky color to use. But for this painting, because there's so little of it, I just love the neutrality and the simplicity of it. So I turned it upside down so that I could use the gravity to get the water to run away from the edge of the bridge, and also to maintain as much of the light down here as I can. Now, before that sky dries, I'm going to just start to lay in some of these background trees. As I said earlier, if things are far away, they will probably have less color on them, less definition, softer edges, that sort of thing. So that's why I want to do it now, because I want it to melt up into the sky. I want these trees to melt into the sky so it's all wet and wet, soft edges. Really, this is just a light mid-tone. That's where I'm going. The bridge is going to be a fairly dark mid-tone dominantly with a few darker, very dark elements. And the background is going to be light into lighter mid-tones. The brush I'm using is one of these liner brushes that has a fat barrel and long quill. It'll get a better workout in a few minutes when I do these larger, slightly more defined trees. But I like these kinds of liner brushes for trees because they can make very scrappy, organic, aerated shapes without causing you to stop and think and try too hard. There will be this tree laid in front of that, so I don't really need to worry too much about the edges. I want to play down the edges back there again as much as I can. This little Holbein mist bottle is one of my best friends. It's great for encouraging colors to blend together on the page organically and for softening edges, etc., etc. It's just great. But it takes a little bit of skill to get used to it. If you spray too much water on your page, obviously all the pigment will wash off, and you probably don't want that. This is a 1/2 inch flat. I'm just cleaning up that wet wash just along the top of the bridge to help pop it out a bit. Now, there'll be a little of that going on over here too, but I'm not too worried about that. You're not going to see a great deal of this. It'll be hidden behind these trees. So I am going to swap out now for this flat brush to just try to imply, without painting in tree trunks and definition back there, just to imply that there are trees back there. I want it to look as far away as I can make it look. So a little bit of texture is a good thing, but too much detail would definitely be a bad thing. This flat brush is cool because you can lay it on its side and just sort of make vertical marks, and into the wet paint, where the paper is a bit drier, you'll get a little definition. Where it's wet, you won't. And I'm trying to just maintain this little jewel of light right there. I think it'll come in handy later. It doesn't look too significant right now, but I think it's going to really be a benefit later on. So my inner monologue is telling me to be careful and not overdo this background. Really, it's called a background for a reason. So I think that's good. I think I dropped in a little bit of sepia, sort of a warm or dark brown tone into the bottoms of these trees, wet and wet, as you can see. And I'm hoping, I think that works, to look like it could be a tree or a lump of trees, a grouping of trees farther away. Okay, the big deal here, of course, as I said earlier, is to save where you want light. I want pure light saved here and here primarily. Again, I said a little bit up there, so I managed to save just a little, and that's good. That's what I want, because I want this path of light when the painting is done to lead the viewer's eye in, over, through, and then up here through the trees, way into the distance. So the distance, the midground, and the foreground, leading you through on that little Z-axis journey. All right, man, leave it alone. Okay, you're looking through, of course, so you're going to glimpse some distant trees. However, the light back here is so critical that you don't want to lose it. So less is more. In this case, I'm going to use a little bit of that olivey tone I used up above. Oh, what I'm painting with as far as color, the sepia I mentioned I dropped in, the Naples yellow in the sky. This olivey green tone is a Daniel Smith serpentine green. Very beautiful color. and it's a little bit more of it here, although it has a little of the brown still mixed in. I'm just using dry brush marks so that I can establish that sort of impressionistic hint that there's trees and tree trunks, but without painting anything back there, to maintain that light. That's what this is all about. A little bit of grass sticks out here. I'm going to, it's fairly minor, but just because I want to emphasize the serpentine nature of this pathway, I will be a little prissy about that too. Okay, but so far what my task was to work in midtones, lighter midtones, and to preserve the areas of light that I designed. And so far so good. You can, when you're doing clouds or anything really, wet in wet, you can use a paper towel to help. It's sort of light lifting. It's really not recommended, but you can do it if it's not dry yet, and you can help add a little bit more brightness to an area. If that area were too wet, that's why I say it's not recommended. You could leave some very ugly streaks. So the shine has gone off, so that makes it easier to manipulate. Okay, now what I want to do, I call watercolor a subtractive technique, which frustrates some people who think that's either confusing or a pretentious way to describe it. I don't mean that. I mean that it in the best way. We start off the blank sheet of paper with 100% of the white, and we, as watercolorists, subtract away parts of it by painting the shades and the shadows to reveal the light that's already there. In oil or acrylic, most every other painting medium, you add light by painting in lighter tones or pure whites, but not in watercolor. You work backwards in a way by saving the light that's already there. So that is why I do those little studies, because without them, I would run the risk of losing the whites. So what I'm doing here is just a tonal wash, sort of carving some light away. That's clear water I painted, of course. This is a Holbein light red tone. It's not really very dark, so nothing to worry about. But I'm just carving away the pure light so that this is almost, I don't want to call it an underpainting because that's not quite descriptive, but it's a tonal paint, a tonal application that will help essentially knock back all the light and just make it easier for me to preserve the light right where I want it. This bit of light where these people are walking, I want it to be as light as possible, but I don't want a crisp, hard edge just yet. So I'm going to wash over it with clear water. Then I'm going to connect it with this strange reddish wash. That'll help me preserve the light where I have it, but then I'll just start to tone the bottom of the painting. It's just going to make it easier for me later when I add my deeper shadows. So this is violet. This is also a Holbein, a mineral violet. And again, there'll be green tones on top of this, but it's very transparent colors, and these will help. These will read through, I hope, into the final work and just help make it easier for me to establish the values where I need them to be. I'm using a fairly large, mid-sized mop brush, not painting within the lines because this is just tonal painting at this point. So it sort of just casts a shade, light mist of water that will just help those tones run together and just make an overall, almost like a filter effect along the sides and bottoms to really concentrate the viewer's eye here, which is going to be the highest area of darks and lights, crisp edges, higher contrast. And this will help diffuse the attention that might go to the outer realms of the painting. Very useful, these tonal washes. They're not exactly like glazes, but in effect, I suppose they serve much the same purpose. Would I do that if I were painting on site? I would. If I were outside on a sunny day, this of course would be dry now, and I'm inside on a rainy day, so it's not dry. Another big thing we all have to think about when we're painting in watercolor is how quick things dry. So since it's not dry, I'll use that as a plus, as an opportunity to just start adding some tonality to the greens that I know are going to be there. This is a bit more of that serpentine olive color. I do have some cerulean over here in the pattern, in my palette. This is a band of light, as I said, but as it reaches up on either side, I think, I don't want it to be bright yellow, but I want the green to have a hint of light in it. So I'll just drop some of this yellow in as not white, obviously, but bright. And then some serpentine down below. And if this runs down over my path a bit, I'm not too concerned. It probably appears a little darker than it really is. It's really not that dark. So this is, quite clearly wet in wet painting, which is great for adding tones, but not specifics, not details, because wet in wet, you can't have a hard edge. Again, I want a little bit of that yellow glow, I think, up on this side. Not as much. The sun is coming from left to right, so logically there'll be more light up there, but a little bit, I think, a few sparkles over here will be fine. And again, this really isn't as descriptive painting as it is tonal painting. It's very, very mid-toned, very wet and wet. All these tones will be there when I'm done, but they'll all blend in and fall a little bit more into the background than you might think once the real dark tonalities start to be laid in. Cool. So yeah, I'm working at a fairly steep angle, but that's because it's just easier to see, it's easier to reach. That's true, but also you don't have to lean over or bend over to paint. It's just a more comfortable position to paint in. And I think more importantly, because it's such a wet, loose medium, you can take advantage of gravity to get the colors to do this kind of thing. They run together organically. That's so beautiful about watercolor. I'm always a little baffled when people don't take advantage of the gravity. It's just there. So far it's free. Generally it's not our friend, but in watercolor painting it really is. So yeah, use it. This is a little bit of that sepia. I'm gonna just add some tones, wet and wet. Again, these won't be that visible or dominant once the painting is dry and more of the darker tones go on. But this is going to help add a bit of anchor to the painting. And make it easier when the time comes to add the dark shadows. They'll be almost half painted just by doing these tonal washes. So I may have to rely on the dreaded hairdryer to move this along, but that's okay. Still quite wet, so I have still the option to manipulate it a little. I love the light saved here, here, here. I think it's not that dark, but I think I may want to try to reclaim a little of this light before it's too dark. Not pure white. I don't think it's ever a great idea to have pure white leading right off your page, but I want a little bit more light in my pathway. Probably not necessary, but I think in the long run I'll be happier. Okay, yes, I'm going to find my hairdryer and speed up the drying process so I can move on to painting the bridge next. Then the trees, these dark trees and shadows will be the last things to go in. So it's not 100% dry, but I think it's dry enough that I can begin to add the bridge. Yeah, it's often better to, I don't know how to describe this. It's easier to show it. Drawing your page too much is not always the thing to do. If this stayed quite wet and I painted the bridge and it just melted in there, that would not be a bad thing at all. So you'll see when I get to it, I'm going to try to recreate that, I'm sure, by misting it to try to, because I'm always trying to connect different parts of my painting. That's what I'm awkwardly, my hoarse voice is awkwardly trying to say. I don't like painting this element, letting it dry, letting it dry, letting it dry. You start to get a painting that looks very disjointed and disconnected. It's almost always better to, in some way or other, make sure all elements of your painting connect. Whatever you can do to make that happen is generally advisable. Right, there's this stone balustrade at the top of the bridge. I think I want to leave a little thread of light as if it's just kissing the top of that bridge. Again, I want this slightly backlit, not really dark, but not in direct sun. So to that end, I'm going to use, this is some raw umber. This is a 1/2 inch flat. Try that out and see how this looks. Okay, here we go. Flat brush because it runs out of paint and you can get these really nice skip marks. I don't mind a few little sparkles of light up inside. In fact, I'm hoping that happens. I'm encouraging it. Then into that raw umber, that neutral warm, I'm going to drop in a little bit of this. This is just straight cobalt blue. So it's kind of a nice mix for stonework. A little bit of warm, a little bit of cool. Definitely not too dark yet. That's okay. It will get there when it needs to. It's a 1/2 inch or 1/8 inch flat. Very good for making quick line work such as that. Here again, I think a little thread of this light reading through. It's not right or wrong. I think it might be, you don't want too much of it, I think. A little bit more at the top makes sense. Now this is the Holbein light red. It's just a nice earthy color. It's red-ish. It's not really red, but it's an earthy, very transparent, beautiful, almost neutral, reddish tone. It's an old bridge. It's in very good condition because they maintain it well. But I want it to look old, so I want it to look a little scrappy here and there. I'm going to just encourage these various areas of wash to run together a bit so it doesn't look too careful or too neatly manicured. I definitely want to play up this warmth though, the red. So I'm not looking at the reference, just going by memory and what I think the painting needs. So this is a bit of a alizarin I'm using, much deeper red. I'm just going to drop it in here and there. Let it run. Yeah, I think that looks more to the value I want. I want a dark midtone to offset these light midtones, but also slightly more intense, almost antique looking red tone. As the bridge comes down to the ground, I think it goes back to stone at the base, but well, not being that accurate, doesn't matter. But I'm just getting a little darker with some additional sepia dropped in, and then a little bit of French ultra blue at the very bottom. Really want to anchor it. I don't, however, want to get anywhere near my really, really deep darks yet, but I want to start to flirt with them, if you will, to sort of cue them up. As this begins to resolve into the hillside, again, as I said earlier, I don't want it to look like it's cut out. So I want it to have some hard edges, some soft edges to marry up with the surrounding landscaping fairly organically. Yeah, I think that's fine. It will be fine. I want to keep this going, so same mojo for the center span. The flat brush, I used to never use flats, but I've become fairly addicted to them. Like anything else, you can overdo them though, and they can. I like everything in my paintings, I like a mixture of things going on, sort of a dialogue of differing elements and techniques. So I like flat brushwork mixed with more traditional round or mop work, when they all join together, it's just very beautiful if they look like they're getting along and playing nicely. So now I think I'm going to go to, I'm going to get ready one of these mid-sized small mops. But before that, some of the sepia tone, I want to eat away some of this light. And then also some French ultra blue. Not too much. I don't want the wall to turn too purple, but a little bit of this, I think, helps make that red look a little more antique and shadier, more backlit, which is what I'm going for. So this is the same style of brush I was using for the background in the sky and this wash, but it's a smaller version. It's still a mop, but a much smaller one. Very, very handy. So now, as this dries, I will go in and, I don't want to over detail the bridge, of course, but I do think it's going to need some dry brush marks and little highlights of shadow here and there. That will all come later once it's more fully fleshed out. Here I'm just using the raw umber and cobalt tones. Down into the more sepia, slightly darker, more saturated tones at the bottom. Being careful here around these figures because this is planned to be very dark, so I think I want to do some reverse painting and allow those figures to be saved light walking out of the shadows, which will hopefully contrast nicely with that figure who will be painted quite dark. This tree will be very dark, so there's really no need to cut in around it. I can just use a slightly larger brush and paint right over it. This side of the bridge, I want a little bit darker than that. There's a, compositionally it'll sing out against the background better. So I'm using slightly deeper tones here and there. some tonal marks made with the flat brush just to add value, but also texture and proper tonality. The whole bridge face needs to look mid-tone dark, and I like these white bits that I've saved, but I think there are too many and they look a little too stripy, so this will help dirty them up a little bit in the right way, I hope. There's so much texture on this bridge in reality. I don't want to make it look grimy, but I do sort of want to give it this patina of age that it has earned. I also just love this kind of painting. Sort of painting half dry, half wet. You don't really know what kind of edges you're going to end up with. It's a bit risky because some of them look great and some not so great. But hey, if you don't try, you don't know. Okay, overall, I think that's good. I am going to allow this to dry a bit more before I put in the dark shadow because I do want a crisper edge there than I might in other cases. So I'm fine with that. I can go over and just quickly paint this end of the little bridge. I like the overall texture. I can see already, I think I'm going to want to, speaking of glazes, probably add a little bit more red to this brick band. That'll be a simple thing to do and I'm nearly done. But I think I've dirtied it up a little too much and I really want that red, not to be accurate to what's really there so much, but it just in terms of the painting, I think it will help. This red tonality will help offset all this cool tones that I've got going on. And it's working, but I think it could be a little stronger. Again, I don't want real hard edges on either side. I want this bridge just graphically and almost philosophically to blend in with the landscape because it does. It doesn't look like an alien spaceship. It really does blend into the landscape of the park, and that's what makes it so beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to do the one of the darkest darks in the painting, which is going to be the shadow under the bridge. And to that end, this is just a gimmick I often do. I don't know that I recommend it. It's not always the thing to do, but I think here it might work. And that is to use complementary tones. I'm going to use blues and blue violets, but then drop in at the peak of the bridge here, of the shadow that is, a little bit of this is a cadmium orange light. As if a little bit of reflected light is bouncing up from the walkway and illuminating the underside of the archway. I say this is a gimmick because it can look great and it can also look really a bit false. So a little tiny bit of that orange is almost all that's needed. And then I'm going to, before it has a chance to set, just knock it back with its complement, blue. This is cobalt, and then I'm going to wash that into French Ultra. So again, the color is nice and not unimportant, but what's really important here is the value. So I want to make sure I leave space enough to get it dark enough. I like this effect. I think there's too much orange. So while it's still fairly wet, I'm going to eat a little bit of away at some of that orange with more cobalt. Yeah, much better. French Ultra Blue, and this has a little bit of neutral tint in it, just to get it dark, but I do want it to stay in the bluish family. Very cool. Again, here I'm going to paint around, at least for now, the tops of these figures to leave them light against this dark, shadowy archway that has this luminous light bouncing up inside. I think I mentioned I'm working on Arches paper today. It's 300 gram or 140 pound, rough surface. Yeah, it's not working. The coloration's nice, value is not there. And this is not one of these I'd like to go back and glaze. I think I have to try to get it as close as I can while it's still wet. So into that wet wash, I'm just dropping more French Ultra, pretty deep blue. I think what it needs, though, at the very base is another complement. So this is brown sepia. Deep blue washing into a deep brown is a very beautiful effect sometimes. Yeah. That I like. Now I've got a very big bead of water at the base, which is good because I'm just going to use it to drag it across to form the other side of my shadow. And also these people inside will be in this deep, dark shadow. A mother and child. Again, I hope it's her child. Let's just assume it is. Shadow is a big deal. At least this bottom portion of it needs to belong to the darkest darks of the painting, because again, I want this rhythm of a dark shadow here, dark shadow here. So dark, light, dark, light, dark, light. So yeah, trying to nail that value is pretty critical. I think I like this glow here. I think I do, but I think ultimately that side of the bridge is going to want to be a little darker to get that to pop. But that's a very easy tweak I can do later. So when you get a big bead of water like this, if you want it to not wash up and create blossoms and blooms, you can touch it with a paper towel or take a brush, pull the water out of it, and just touch the point, and it'll siphon up the rest of that bead. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the blue, orange, red electricity that's happening. More greens are coming, but deeper greens primarily. And I think overall there'll be a nice balance of color and values. Let's hope. I think so. You gotta have confidence, even if you don't. Gosh, I hear that so often. People say, I have no confidence, I'm afraid. I get it, but it's just painting. If you do a bad painting, it's not the end of the world. I learn more from my bad paintings, and man, do I do a lot of them. Anyway, I learn a lot more from my bad ones than I do the good ones. And if I'm being really honest, why not? I'm not sure how many really good paintings I've done in my life. I've done countless thousands of paintings. I could probably, over a glass of something, admit that I've done maybe half a dozen over all those years that I think are actually good. And even those could use improvement, of course. And it doesn't mean I'm that hard on myself. I'm kind of not. I mean, I am, but it doesn't mean I don't think I have skill. I just understand that it's a process. I also believe firmly that if I ever start thinking I absolutely know what I'm doing, it's probably over. So here I'm working into semi-wet, so I'm playing around with edges and lack of edges in a way that I hope works. It's always a bit of a Russian roulette. But again, trying to join different elements of the painting together, adds little hints of definition without it looking technical or tight. And yeah, it's that toggle between clarity and lack of clarity that can be so appealing in a painting. Beautiful cutouts. I don't know that blue is the right tone, but it doesn't matter. It's value more important than color in that case. So I add a little bit of definition. So dry brush, semi-dry brush. I don't want to fiddle too much with the bridge. I see a few little things I need, but probably really not that much. And worst thing to do would be to overcook it. I am notorious for overworking my paintings. Try as much as I might not to. I think for years I didn't have the skill to know when I should just stop. Then it became sort of a thing. I just love painting so much that it's hard for me to just say, oh, look at that, I'm done. But that is a real skill. I think we could all benefit from getting better at just putting our brushes down and walking away. I think at this stage, the bridge looks good. I could really overwork it. I was saying earlier how I thought I'd want to go back in and add more red, and I'm not convinced that is the thing to do now. So I think I'm just going to move on, lay in these trees, and then I can reassess at what I think it needs or possibly doesn't need. This tree is compositionally important, but not as big a deal as these guys. It's not as close to us, so it doesn't need the stark value and or definition. Again, I was saying, for me, it's a very bad idea to overdraw your tree shapes. I think it's fine to locate the sort of overall area you imagine that you might want them to occupy in your painting, but to draw all the leaves can be a real disaster. So I've just drawn sort of a canopy for this. Going back to this liner brush I was using, again, it has sort of a fat barrel, long quills. I lay it on its side and I really just sort of push it over the surface. I'm not pressing down very hard because I want this kind of scrapey, aerated look. It looks so much more like actual tree foliage than drawing all those leaves ever could. Takes much less time, and yeah, it doesn't always work, but it works for me more often than it doesn't. So colors, I'm using, this is serpentine green as a base, dropping in a little bit of viridian that I just happen to have stuck in my palette for some reason because I don't use it much. But it's a nice fresh green, and it helps add variety. I think the key to painting green, I love green as a color, but as a pigment, generally it is argumentative, often dries very gray and flat. I think the key is, well, several things, but I think one of the big takeaways for me was variety. By that I mean modify your greens with warms, with cools. By dropping in some blue at the bottom, I sort of gave this tree a shape it wouldn't necessarily have had. Some warms at the top, some raw umber, even some light red. Obviously, warm is a complement to cool, red specifically to green, so it can go more neutral, but overall it gives an electricity to both your painting and the area that you are painting. So yeah, modify your greens with warms and sometimes cools as well, and use a variety of different greens. You can either mix them yourself or buy them. There's countless pigments to buy. Oh, as far as approach, when I'm painting my trees, almost always I do the foliage first, as you see, and then before it has a chance to set or dry, I will lay in the trunks and major branches so that they all melt and bleed together. And I think overall this just helps make trees that look a great deal more realistic or feel more realistic and look a lot more organic than any other way I've found to paint them. So I'm not saying it's the only way or even the best way, but it is one way and it works for me almost always. So for the trunks, I'm just using this sepia brown. It melts nicely in with the blues, with the warms, and the the reddish tones and definitely the greens. Makes a pretty convincing looking tree. I'm okay with the colors, I'm fine with the values. I think this looks a little prissy or overworked, so I'm gonna mess it up with a little bit of mist, just to soften some of those edges and let some of those shapes run together. I don't want to eat away all that yellow tone that I have on there, so I want to police that a little close. So yeah, the mist bottle can be your best friend, but it can also be one of those best friends that gives you trouble. Right. I actually think that's fine. That tree sort of dissolves as it goes off the page. I think that's good. I'm trying to keep most of my crisp edges and clarity here at the center of focus. So I don't want anything to pull me out of the painting on the bottom, sides, or top. So I'm not mad about that at all. I quite like it. Here I want to lay in some deeper greens for these shrubs that happen along the sides of the walkway. And then just try to resolve this area. This is a deeper green, a jadeite, also a Daniel Smith. Good value, but also sort of looks characteristic of some of these actual shrubs that line the walkways. But I'm not picking this for realism or accuracy. I'm really picking it for value. And I like this value jump. I want some there, but not too much. Again, I don't want to pull the viewer's eye out of the page over to the left or right. So I may want to back off that. Also, I'm going to go back to my flat brush, some of this serpentine green just to muck up those edges. Be a little less specific about what happens down here. Again, over here, I like the value jump, I like the coloration, but I think a little bit too much specificity right at the edge of the painting. So, another little trick, I'll take a piece of paper, lay over it as a kind of masking. That'll soften up the edge, but won't touch that. And that's better already. It helps all this sort of blend up into all that. This is some Holbein lavender. The other semi-opaque I sometimes use. It's a bluish, I mean, obviously it's lavender, but it's a bluish tone, fairly light. It sinks down into these heavy washes, especially of green, and then floats back up to the top, making these sort of intentional blossoms. They can add textures, some hints of light without being pure white, And they can add clarity or obscurity depending on how opaquely you paint with them. Yeah, that'll do. That looks fine. Now the big trees and the area on this side of the painting. Naturally, I have to put in the people, but they're not unimportant. Who's unimportant? But compositionally, they're not as important as these trees are, or certainly the bridge. So they will be among the last things to go in. Probably use a little bit more value just here at the bottom. Connecting shapes, it's all shapes. Painting is just shapes. It is helpful to me, I hope to you too, to think about your painting as that, just a collection of shapes. Dark shapes, light shapes, mid-tone shapes, warm, cool shapes of color, rather than thinking about your painting as a realistic collection of things. It helps me to just think of it in more abstract terms, so that I don't get too lost in representation or accuracy, which, you know, is again, not wrong. It's not my thing, but it's another way to paint. I like my paintings to have sort of a really nice mix of realism and abstraction, soft edges, lost edges, all these contradictory things meeting together. Not all two paintings are the same, so some paintings may look a little more realistic or representational. Others may look way more out there and disconnected from reality. Again, it just depends on your intent and what you're up to. Here I'm just trying to make the edge of this tree look a little bit, add a little clarity just around here, the center of focus, and make the edge of that tree look a little more elegant and resolved. That side of the tree can look very unresolved. This side of the tree, I think, needs a little bit of that clarity. That's enough. Right. It's spring. The tree leaf coverage isn't that heavy. Again, not that I have to be that representational or realistic, but I do think the graphics of these big trunks to me is a little more important. So I'm gonna, for this painting, it's a little more important. So I'm gonna keep the leaf coverage somewhat sparse. Again, back to this liner brush. I'm sort of squeezing out most of the water onto the palette, and I'm just scraping it, pushing it into the paper in this case, to get these hopefully organic looking tree shapes to look, or leaf shapes to look convincing. I think that's fine. Again, fewer is generally always going to be better. Here, these overhanging leaves of this more forward tree are going to be a little bit different story. I want them to be a little bit darker. So I'm going to take some jadeite green, mix it in the palette, which I don't normally do, but I'm going to, with a little bit of alizarin, to get a fairly deep green. And you can see here already, as this tree visually laps over this tree that's in the distance, because of the value shift, this one will start to look more forward of that one, and certainly those in the distance. Again, I don't want a real heavy leaf coverage. I want this to look kind of lacy, and the emphasis perhaps to go on the branches and trunk, but the leaves do serve a very important compositional role here. I'm going to have, I can imagine one small branch coming down over the front of the bridge a bit. No need to go crazy and overdo it, but I just know that I'm going to want to do that. I can add more leaves later if I want. I think that may be enough for now. I'm not really thrilled with some of their shapes. They're not that elegant looking. There's a bit too much water, I think, in the brush. But it's all right, I'll clean it up. I'm just sort of placing areas of value right now more than anything. Then just to balance, I'll add a few on this side, but not as many, obviously. Just to help pull, again, this tree out in front of the others. All right. Yeah, I can see it happening. So I got to get moving and start to lay in the trunks and branches. I'm going to use similar tones as I did in the shadow, I think. So predominantly this dark brown sepia. And then into that, I'm sure I'll be mixing a little bit of the dark blue ultra. I want to try to get as much of this on before all those leaves dry up as I can to help, as I said earlier, get them to organically bleed together. I'm using a flat brush so that I get this very textural sort of vibe happening. If it leaves some bits of unplanned white showing through, I have no problem with that at all. That's fine. I don't want too much of it, but I think some of that is good. It'll imply the texture of the tree trunk and bark and all of that. Here I'm just using this smallish mid-size mop, just dragging it through those areas of foliage in a calligraphic manner to get them to bleed together quickly. I'm doing my best to just do this quickly and not overthink it. It almost always looks better when you do that. A little less planned, a little bit more intuitive. Yeah, these have set up a good deal already, but it'll be okay. I've taken a few calligraphy courses. It's quite amazing what some people can do. Of course, you can study a lifetime. Right, now I want to do a very long, thin one. So when you're doing these branches in this calligraphy, you can do some that are a little bit more deliberate, and then just very quickly dry brush in a few more smaller, less substantial ones just for texture and that sort of thing. Yeah, this needs a little bit of finesse, but I think I'm going to go to a smaller brush still and to flesh that out. But so far, I'm not mad about that. I think it looks pretty good. It needs a little help, but it is not terminal. More important, I finish up the bigger areas first, then I'll go back and add some finesse up there. And I want to lay in this secondary foreground tree here. Try to keep this one wet. If the sun's coming this way, the shadows will be going left to right. So I'm going to drop in some deep blue tone on the right side of this tree, the shady side, and be a little more vigorous with the brush marks on the left side, as if to imply sun glinting off of it. It looks okay. Let it go, Tom. Let it go. So this guy back here, I'm using similar coloration, but this is raw umber that I'm going to wash up into blue, probably just ultramarine, because it's in my palette. But I'm steering away from the very, very darks that I used on this one. So it looks darker than the bridge, I hope, but lighter than this. So you start to emphasize that sense of dimensionality and depth that I'm so crazy about. But as far as paint application, much the same. Slightly darker on the shady side, more dry brush on the sun side to leave a few little sparkles of light. Then I especially don't want the bases of these trees to dry too quickly and not be connected to the ground. So hopefully before that's set, I'll be able to start laying in the landscape. All right. So for now, sort of same colorations as some of the sepia, the flat brush, and I'm going to try to save some sparkles of that light that might be just touching this side of the hill. So there'd be some of this yellow green showing through. Yeah, the idea's okay, but that looks goofy, so no worries, it's still wet, so I can still have plenty of time to screw it up. This is some French Ultra. Yeah, that looks a little better, but it's getting a little heavy, so I'm going to back off. I'm not looking at it, but I'm thinking heavily now about my value study, and I know that this band of light reading through is one of the most critical things I've got, so I want to maintain as much light up through this corridor as I can. So some secondary shadows, but again, I want to leave a nice patterning of light. So because the sun's coming this way, this tree would make a shadow across the pathway. This tree will make obviously a much larger one, and there'll be trees off the side, which I want to make a very dark graphic. But there'll be a secondary one here. I think for that, I'm going to use the 1/8 inch flat. Just keep it simple and keep it sort of a blue-violet shadow from these rocks off and then right across where those people are. Generally okay. Yeah, I need to assess it, but I think it's okay. So this is a smaller, thinner version of the mop brushes I've been using all day. This is just some of that sepia tone that I'm going to use to add slightly smaller filigree of branch work coming down. Love doing this kind of thing. So here, around the center of focus, I can afford to get a little precious as the painting radiates out from there. At least that's generally my philosophy. Around the center of focus is where your deepest shadows, generally your hardest edges, could be found. The most contrast and saturation. And then as the painting radiates out from that point, less and less specificity, less and less detail. It's just a subtle way to orchestrate where you want the viewer's eye to go. Just adding a little finesse with this pointed brush, some more specific leaves here and there. This kind of thing is fine, but also slightly risky. You can go overboard because it's fun to do and you forget, and before you know it, you've added way too much. I'm going to let it go with that. I think the main thing I'm driving at is to try to set up these layers of distance, these layers of elements that imply foreground, midground, background. And so far it's working in that despite all the somewhat attention I put on that bridge, I think you can now see it's far from the darkest thing in the painting. It's definitely in the darker mid-tone range, and that's what I wanted. I wanted it to have this somewhat, certainly not ghosty feeling, but this idea that it wasn't right in your face. That kind of technical look is what I was assiduously trying to avoid. So generally it's working. And another reason I stopped myself from doing too much detail work on the bridge, because I knew anything more I did would start to make it pull forward a little, and I definitely want it to fall into the midground. I am going to darken slightly around not 100% sure it needs any of this, so I'm going to try to keep my interventions here minimal, because overall I think the bridge is working. Best to just leave it. Couple last elements need to go in just to finish this. The major element is this deep foreground shadow, so I will do that now. And if you remember, I wanted a shadow coming from off the page to connect the bottom of the tree, stretch out across the lawn, then across the path, and connect up with this figure in shadow here. Sounds simple enough. So this character just needs to be dark. Color isn't too critical. So I'm just using fairly opaque neutral tint with one of these mid-size or smaller mop brushes, so I can be a little bit specific, at least about the top part of the body. Head, neck, shoulders. I don't want it to look too opaque. So while it's wet, I'm going to drop a little color into that wet wash that will imply some coloration to clothing without, actually showing anything specific. I think warm. I think registering the bridge tones would be smart, and it'll be dark. So this is just cad red orange. So when you do this, you can see it still looks like a figure in shadow, but there is some color to it. Key here is just to work quickly and not get too hung up in details. It's going to be fine. This figure is a shape and a part of a larger shape. So what he's wearing, what he's doing, all of that aren't too important. He has an important compositional role, but what shirt or shoes he put on that day are not critical. So you can see right now, he does look forward of the bridge, and the shape and the value sort of are in dialogue with the trees, which I love. But of course, what I don't like, but that's fine because I'm going to address it now, is the fact that he looks pasted on. You don't want that. You want everything in your painting to look connected. So before it dries, I'm going to grab a large-ish, if I can find it. Did I leave it outside? Oh dear. Well, this will have to do. A large flat brush. This isn't quite the one I wanted, but it'll do. Because I have to do this quickly. All my talking, I'm going to let him dry up too much, and I don't want that. So this is a bluish violet, and I'm going to drag it right through the bottom of this figure and let him melt into the I think perhaps a better brush would be a mid-sized mop brush. So this is some of the violet tone with a little bit of neutral tint mixed in, just to get the value. Into that, I'm going to drop, while it's still quite wet, French Ultra. Some sepia. Feather this out. This tree trunk is dried a bit, which is good, so I can add a bit more texture. I'm going to drop into this a little bit of jadeite green. We're on the areas of grass now. And again, not to be representational, but just, I think it needs the deep green to sing off the red tones. And again, the value is what's critical here. So I'm nursing the edge of this shape. If the edge of your dark shape is dark enough, the body of your dark shape can be a lot lighter, but the edge of it needs to be the right value for the whole shape to work properly. So I'm dumping in pigment to get it dark enough. Generally speaking, it's working, but I can't wait too long. I have to finish off the bottom of the wash, which I'm going to use a little bit of this light red from up above and just let it all run together. Similarly, the way you don't want white reading right off the page too much, you don't want super dark necessarily. Always exceptions, but generally that's not a great idea. So all the big elements of the painting are in. This looks okay. Looks a little less, a little assertive. So I'm going to mist this, encourage these tones to run a little bit more. It's better. And the sunny side of this tree is fine, but it looks a little clunky, so I will add a little bit of identity to it. This is just sepia and a small flat brush. Take away a little bit of the light, but connect that tree a little bit more to the landscape. Seems appropriate, especially since it's largely in shadow. Up here, that doesn't bother me. Not really what I had planned, that much light, but I think it's kind of nice. That little spot of light from the sun, the light, the light, the light, the light, the light. If anything, a little bit more there would have been nice, but it's hardly tragic. The tops of the trees purposefully look a little unresolved. I rather like that. I don't want a big, heavy top, and I don't want the bottom too heavy. I want this edge of the shadow dark, but that's why I dropped in the red to sort of soften the very edge of it. And it's still got a bit heavier than I wanted. I don't hate it, it's fine, but the purpose of all that, what I'm saying is I'm trying to concentrate the viewer's eye here. And generally speaking, it's working. This is a bit more of that light red. Yeah, that helped. That lightened up the heaviness of the shadow, but it maintained the dark edge, which is critical. So I'm going to try to be happy with that and leave it alone. So figures, people, not too much to do. I do want to maintain the lightness of the tops of these figures, but as they come down, I think I'm going to add some tone to anchor them to the pathway and to belong to the shadow cast by this other tree. This figure is done. These figures in shadow are done. The figures way in the distance aren't that critical. but I'm going to take some yellow ochre and just very lightly, very schematically give them a little bit of identity. You want them to look far away because, well, they are. Okay, now these, I think I'll do them as a set. I'll just start with some clear water so I don't end up with a hard line, and maintain the light at the top. And then into that clear water, I'll wash in some color. They don't need a lot of detail, obviously, but they need a little bit of identity. Yes, so this is cobalt blue, just at the lower portion of this person. Not a lot of detail, but just a suggestion. And similarly with his friend here, into that clear water, a little bit of this warm tone. Color here is really insignificant. It's just about value and shape. And of course, connections, trying to connect everything to the painting. A little bit of that light at the tops of the figures I think was a good choice, but I didn't need as much as I thought I might, so that's fine. Then one of them has a silly little dog. I'm not making disparaging comments. I have a silly little dog, Otis. Again, if you're drawing dogs, bicycles, generally, unless they're the focal point of your painting, keep them simple and schematic. A couple little marks tells the story. You don't need more than that. If you start getting too picky and detailed, they look really weird and out of place. I should help myself, but I can't. I'm going to drop a little bit of this orange into this one figure. Not altogether sure it's a great idea, but I'm doing it anyway. I think this will tell sort of another color story or enhance the one I already have. Okay, overall that's it. I can see some things I'll want to do later. I do think a little bit more finesse up here, but I don't want to do it yet because it's so easy to overcook that, and I don't want too much attention traveling up there. I like the general vibe of the values. The darks, the midtones, the lights are where I want. The light, 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 light. That all works. I see a very clear foreground, a clear midground, and a clear background, which also works. These saved white bits were not really planned, but overall at this stage, I'm very happy with them. I think they're fine. They don't jump out as being out of place, and I don't think it's worth it to try to do anything. I could see adding a little finesse to the trees, the trunks, but again, I think maybe not. I don't think it's meant to be a sketch, you know, not tree portraits, so I don't want to over detail them. And definitely no more work on the figures. I think they're there, they set the tone, they're schematic. but they're not overly detailed, so they don't run the risk of detracting. Values generally work. I like the color story of warms versus cools. I'm a little unsure whether I should add more warmth to the bridge or not. I intended to up until a few minutes ago, and then the more I looked at it, I got afraid it would start making the bridge look overworked and overly detailed, but also pull it forward into the painting. And I like the way it's laying back nicely into the midground now, so I don't want to do anything to disrupt that. I even considered, if I'm honest, darkening this shadow yet again. I still could make an argument for that, but again, I'm afraid if I did, it would conflict too much with this value, and right now it's laying very nicely in the midground. If I darken it, it'll tend to pull forward a bit much, I think. So the value range here is pretty wide, but it's nowhere near black. There is pure white, but the darks are sort of a dark, probably 60% gray, 70% maybe at the most. And I think it rather works. It gives the painting overall, I think, a spring-like or early summer lightness and airiness, and I like that. This tree got fuzzy, and I do think a little more clarity there wouldn't kill it, but not much, doesn't need much. But overall, the whole point of this painting was, in a way, how to interpret your reference photos, how to establish a hierarchy of what you want to paint and what you don't need to paint, how to establish depth by modulating and designing your values, and how to set up a narrative, simple narrative in this case, contrasting the man-made world with the natural, and then a whole series of contrasts within that: light, dark, horizontal, vertical, diagonal, warm, cool. Lots of things we could talk about. Technically, I could probably critique this for 2 hours, but it's not worth it. The overall story, I think, is there, and it's pretty true to my reference photo. It's pretty much bang on. I mean, not my reference, but my value study. If I can find the reference. Yeah, I mean, it's recognizably the same bridge, but if I may say so, I think the painting is an improvement over the photograph. But again, I just want to emphasize, it's one way to go about it. I don't have the answers for you. I don't even know if I have the answers for me, but I do have a direction for myself, and I wish that for all of you. So I hope you can take anything at all you've gleaned from this demonstration to apply to your own work. Throw out what you don't like, employ what you do, make it your own. Always paint your own subjects too. There's quite a habit or tradition of copying others' work. I do understand it. It's not a bad way to learn how to apply paint, but I think once you get past those very, very basics, you're doing yourself a disservice to continue copying the work of others. I think you're always going to learn more. You're always more invested intellectually and emotionally when you paint subjects that are your own, subjects that you feel strongly about. So don't be afraid. Venture out, give it a try. If you screw it up, it's too bad, but it's just a piece of paper. You can try again. Anyway, thank you all for your time, and I'll see you soon.